Welcome to the Circumcision Chronicles Uncut podcast. This is really our first podcast because the prior 18 episodes that we've done have all been interviews, and this is really our first podcast. So from the Intaction podcast studios, you have Anthony Lasquadro. I'm the director of Intaction. And
Michael Winnell from Foreskin Revolution
of Australia. Great to have you here, Michael. We're just going to have a little discussion just on current events, what's happening in the Intactivist world, and what our respective organizations are doing, and what's going on. But first, I want to say, I saw that Brother K. Did you see the Brother K episode on Tasho on Comedy Central?
Yeah, it was hilarious. It was great.
I mean, it's pretty amazing. First of all, that we have an Intactivist on television. I don't know if that's considered network television. I guess it's
Comedy Central.
Yeah,
right. So
cable television. Kind of prime time during the week. It's pretty amazing that Tasho, saw this cause and he was inspired by it, and he asked Brother K from the Bloodstained Men to come on and talk about it. I thought that was pretty amazing. I think that Intactivism is really coming into the mainstream culture here. It's just a sign of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was so professionally shot. They developed their own studio for it, their own instead of perfect. What is it? Instead of Parenthood, they had
it was Planned Penishood.
Planned Penishood.
Penishood, get it? In case anybody missed that.
Yeah, and then they've got a huge viewership, so it really is hitting the big time with the issue.
Yeah, definitely props to Brother K for getting that and getting on that show. I like when he was doing it. They're fiddling around with the Gomco clamp, and he kind of suggested Tosh put his finger in it, and I thought that was good. And at the end, he asked Brother K, he's like, "Well, if you woke up one morning and you had your foreskin back, what would you do?" And it was a long break of silence, and then Brother K finally says, "Oh, I think I'd get a beer."
A beer and a big party.
Yeah. So that was pretty cool. In this podcast, we're going to use the F word. We're going to throw the F word around quite a bit.
Oh, I don't know about that sort of language, Anthony.
The F word, of course. What were you thinking of? I'm thinking of foreskin.
Oh, of course.
Right? Yeah. So, when it comes to something like Brother K, this is a really serious issue, and I know a lot of people consider genital cutting and genital mutilation or circumcision, whatever you want to call it, it's a really serious issue, but it's okay to use some comedy to get our message across. So things like being on Tasho and using some humor to open people up. Circumcision has so many hypocrisies in it that it's a hypocrisy and it's dissonance, and this is why comedians feed off of that, because comedy is based on things that when you have two things that just are hypocrisy or and people are trying to block it out of their mind, and comedians are good at picking that apart and taking that thread and pulling on it, and that's makes things funny. It's funny and it's entertaining, but it's serious at the same time, and it gives people the opportunity to kind of really reflect about what this issue is. And why are we cutting off healthy body parts off of babies and causing stress and trauma for? And at the same time, foreskin is so important, and the rest of the world doesn't do this. This myopic American view that everybody does this, and this is why we do it, even though it's insane. So, I mean, what do you think about that? From the Australian take, or what do you think about the issue? Using humor to express the values of Intactivism.
Well, look, that's an interesting lead-in, talking about the US myopic viewpoint. In view of the fact that places like Australia and New Zealand and England, they're sort of the fellow English-speaking world have largely abandoned circumcision. So that's the first point that I think is something that if a lot of Americans knew that would give them pause for thought. If they knew that their brother and sister countries used to cut and now no longer cut, that would I think really change a lot of people's viewpoints. And when you look at the fact that infant health and the health in children and in the general population in those countries is the equal highest in the world. So it's interesting when you look at Intactivism and the issue of circumcision in a place like Australia. Australia used to cut the majority of its boys. So in the 1950s, the cutting rate was about 80%, and since then it's had a downward trend to now it's about 10% or less. And so that presents these interesting differences. So Australia's had its tipping point. Its tipping point was in the 1970s. And so when I was born in the late 70s, half the boys were cut, half weren't. So I grew up in this world where half my friends were cut and half weren't. And so it was really obvious that there were these negatives to circumcision because so many of us had our whole body, were healthy and got to enjoy it. And our circumcised brethren were not seeing any benefits. They were just missing something. Whereas the rest of us were really happy, healthy, and thriving just the same, but with this extra complete, luscious, sensitive body part. And so then you fast forward to today where virtually all the kids are protected in Australia. There still is some work to do, but compared to America, there's a big difference. And it presents differences with Intactivism because the population in Australia are much more amenable to the message of protecting children. They're much more amenable to the message that the whole body is natural and healthy, that the foreskin is natural and healthy. Given that the Australian medical community at large have been supporting this message, have been against circumcision for about the last 40 years, and they even, in their position statement, the RACP even acknowledged the functional value of foreskin, given that many Australians agree with that point of view. So there's a lot less of a struggle and a lot less resistance as there is in the States. So the challenges are different in Australia. It's more a case now of just, bad pun here, cleaning things up. It's more a case of just getting everything in lockstep because medical organisations are against circumcision. The population at large, for example, 9 out of 10 parents in Australia do not cut their kids, so the population at large are against it. But it's just about squaring away those last little bits of organisations and legislation to protect all children.
Now, do you know when the RACP, which is the Australian Pediatric Society?
Yeah. Yes, the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, the peak medical body in Australia on this issue.
Do you know when they came out so strongly? Do you know what the year was that they might have come out with the do not recommend circumcision policy statement?
In 1972, that's when they first changed their position statement to reflect that circumcision was no longer mandated or necessary. And since then, every sort of 5 or 10 years, they've put out a new position statement reflecting an even stronger position. And it's really been sort of since the 80s and 90s, they've moved completely away from circumcision. They explicitly do not recommend it. They think the risks outweigh any potential benefits, and they see the foreskin as functional. They acknowledge that in their position statement. And they've taken it out of hospitals. The big thing they did in Australia was around all the states, they took circumcision out of hospitals. So in Australia, you cannot get your child circumcised in a hospital. You birth your child, and then the nurses are just like, right, go home. And there's no like, oh, would you like us to circumcise the child or give us money and we'll cut it. It's just, you then go home. And so in Australia, that really reduces the circumcision rate because they're not being prompted to circumcise their children. And there's not this incentive for doctors to make money from it because doctors aren't allowed to do it in hospitals anymore.
Right, they're not soliciting it like they do in the States.
They're not soliciting. So in other words, to do it, you birth your healthy, happy child, you then go home, and then you have to think, oh, okay, I'm adamant about this, I want to get it circumcised. You have to make inquiries, make calls, book an appointment with a paediatrician. Very few will offer circumcisions in Australia because the medical bodies at large have moved away from it. So you've got to find someone who'll do it, then you've got to pay for it out of pocket, so it might be, say, $1,000. And so that really makes it a lot more difficult, which has helped push the rate down, and so it should be. The regular citizen should not be paying for this in hospitals. They're not paying, yeah.
I would think that also doctors, if a patient or parents, not the patient, but the parents came to us, so we want a circumcision, if the doctors did a circumcision and something went wrong, which we know happens more often than people realize, that they're what they call botches or complications, I would think they're almost liable for malpractice at that point when you have a professional medical society with a we do not recommend you do this, and then a doctor goes ahead anyhow because the parents want it, and he does it, and then something goes wrong, and now you know what's going to happen. The parents are going to turn on the doctor and say, you know, you're liable for this, and we're going to sue you for millions of dollars because your own. We didn't. The parents are like, we didn't know that the medical society didn't recommend that this be done. So I would think maybe even doctors, once a policy like that comes out, the doctors might be scared to do it.
Yeah, it's a ticking time bomb. It's absolutely a ticking time bomb. At some point, you know, people are going to sue for, you know, 10 to 20% of circumcisions cause terrible complications that result in the child having to be taken back to a pediatrician or urologist to get corrective surgery, such as 10% of children suffer from meatal stenosis after they're circumcised, so the urethra shrinks, they have to go in for more corrective surgery, and there's a host of other things that happen. So yes, at some point you would think that people will take legal action. It's a disaster waiting to happen.
If they do it. And luckily, most of them are not doing it. Mike, I know you've told me you've been traveling around quite a bit, and you've been going on a world tour and trying to learn about Intactivism around the world. And I'm interested to hear, and I'm sure our listeners are interested to hear, some of the things that you've experienced and some of the things you've learned in traveling to Europe and some other places, and what people are doing to try to reduce genital cutting.
Yes, absolutely. So Foreskin Revolution, we started up this year in April and May, and so we wanted to really expand our outreach to learn what we could from what are the most innovative trends around the globe in terms of Intactivism and children's rights. So I set off on a journey about a month or two ago. I went to Europe first to find out what is going on in Europe, because the perception I held was that it seemed to me, and this was wrong by the way, it seemed to me that not a lot was going on because Europe doesn't do circumcision. And I wanted to work out what the real truth was, who is over there, who's doing what, and what I discovered blew my mind. Contrary to that view that Europeans aren't doing anything about the issue of circumcision because they don't circumcise. On the contrary, yes, they don't circumcise, but they are doing a lot. They're very active and very innovative. And my travels first took me to Intact Denmark, and I met Lena Nihus, who is the chair of Intact Denmark, and she's brilliant. She is a maverick. She's a genius. She has a whole host of strategies. She works across all different tiers at all different levels to help protect children in Denmark. She works across all different political parties, all different medical organisations, all different social advocacy, education. She works at all levels, and it's totally systematic. So nothing is left. Everything is covered. They even have really innovative education campaigns where they wear blow-up penis suits, because that disarms passerbys who laugh, and they come up and say, what's the big penis suit all about? And then when people are laughing, they're more receptive to information. But you know, her real brilliance is in her strategy, her systematic organisation, the fact that she does liaise with all the political parties, all the medical organisations, and all the relevant lateral allies that are secular groups, atheist societies, feminist groups, that she can bring together to work towards this unified goal. And so that's really opened my eyes to how I can implement the same sort of strategies in Australia, rather than just focusing on street education, right? Public advocacy, how I can expand that to all these other levels. From there, I went to England, to 15 Square in Staffordshire, which is just below Manchester. And I met the legendary David Smith, and he was just fantastic. He works with a young gentleman, Jason, and together they're a duo, and they have some other team members, and they have some very innovative strategies. Like Intact Denmark, they work across multiple levels, not just social advocacy, but for example, in 15 Square's case, some of the key areas they focus on is patient support, and I think it's brilliant. So if anyone in Europe or anywhere in the world has an inquiry and they write to 15 Square, you know, when I was 5 or 10, the doctor said I had phimosis and circumcised me, and now I have problems, 15 Square will give them advice and put them in contact with the right resource, with the right support person, whether it be a nurse or a doctor who really understands the issue, with support groups, a psychologist who can help people with psychological distress. So it's a brilliant strategy, and again, that's something I want to implement in Australia.
And the name 15 square, I guess that refers to that the adult male foreskin is 15 square inches. Is that what they're getting that from?
You bet, baby. 15 squares of pure joy. Yeah, keep it on. Don't cut it off.
I wonder what that would be in centimeters. I don't know.
You're looking at about 35 square centimeters. And then the other really wonderful strategy that they implement is they're working on patient support, and then they're also working at the university level. So they liaise with Keele University, which is in the sort of southern Manchester area, they run symposiums. They do research with I think people from the legal department there. And it's a brilliant collaboration because it adds a ton of credibility to their operation. And also by then working together to do symposiums, that again raises the intellectual level, the credibility level. It brings in thought leaders from across the planet. And then you'll see on YouTube and etc. on the internet, you'll see some of their videos they've posted from these symposiums with brilliant speakers like, the ethicist Brian Erb from Yale University, with Anthony Lempert, the doctor from the UK who's presented at the United Nations on the issue. They have experts from all across the field. James Chedwigan, if I'm saying that correctly, who's a barrister from the UK who has worked on cases in the UK, and he talks about how there has been progression in the UK.
Yeah. Barrister is a lawyer in English speak.
Yes, lawyer. I don't know if they still wear wigs. I don't know. But he's talked about how there's been a progression. In other words, the justice system in the UK is now recognising more and more the harms of circumcision and sort of ruling more in favour of protecting children. There is that progression, there is that light at the end of the tunnel, but 15 Square bring that all together beautifully. So you can see the strategic innovation there. I met in London with Men Do Complain with Richard Dunker, and he was the first. Do you know what he was?
He was the founder of the bloodstained suit.
That's it. He was the first bloodstain wearing suit man. And Richard's a very creative gentleman. I think a lot of his career was in video making or filmmaking, so I think he really drew from that with his artistic sensibility. And what he ended up then doing is a lot of street demonstrations in England. And like you asked me before, what's it like doing activism in Australia? In England, it's a different nuance to the US. There's less hostility because by far and away, most British, if not all British, do not circumcise. So it's Muslim British and Jewish British that circumcise. So the regular British person that walks past one of his demonstrations, they typically are more amenable to the message or agree with the message. He's even had mothers come up to him screaming at him, and he thought they were angry at him, but instead they were screaming because they were horrified to find out that circumcision goes on in England and that some healthcare money is going towards that. The point I was making about Australia, it's madness to think public healthcare money, like my taxes in Australia, is going towards subsidising circumcision of children, which the medical body's against in Australia, which the medical body's against in Britain. So this sort of contradiction cannot stand. So Richard is a wonderful role model for activists, founder of the Bloodstained Suit, and he's doing great work with street demonstrations. And the point he really emphasises with his wonderful website, Men Do Complain, is that lots of men complain about the harms of circumcision. I bet you get this all the time, that people say to you, "Oh, men never complain," right?
We, in the past, we've people come up and say, "What's wrong with circumcision?" I've never heard anyone complain about it. and we had a huge campaign that said circumcision, I did not consent. I said, well, now you know that people do complain about it.
Right, and I think some people it goes over their head. And exactly, and Richard makes the point that tons of men complain. It's just that they don't have an organised voice. So that's one of the things he's trying to do, is organise their voice. And you don't hear about it. Plus, we live in a culture where it's not as socially acceptable for men to share vulnerability, intimacy, or their grief or sense of loss. so it gets swept under the rug. So he's doing a great job trying to let people see that voice. And like he said to me, he said, where are the longitudinal studies on men that are circumcised throughout the decades of life to show if they've had problems? There are none. Because there's not money in it. The money is in cutting the child, doing the surgery, right? The money's not in keeping the healthy body part there and doing a long-term study.
They don't want to do that because they don't want to know the answers.
Right.
They don't want to know. They don't want to show that, all of this pro-circumcision policy, especially in the U.S., that's gone on for decades and decades and decades, was wrong.
Right. And Richard points out, if we did do a longitudinal study, so you'd measured someone when they were born, they got circumcised, then at age 5, 10, 15, 20, if they had any problems, of which about 20% do, but he makes a point, once you get to 30 and 40, you'd see another whole swathe of guys having problems, and then at 50 and 60, another whole swathe. And so that's one data point we're really lacking, is the effect long-term over a man's life, because he may not have any problems till he's 50. But they're problems that could have been avoided.
Right.
So,
well, just like one famous example is Jimmy Kimmel, the late night talk show host. He had meatal stenosis, and he commented on that, and he had to go in for surgery. That's a narrowing of the urethra, which can make urination difficult. So he had to go back for surgery to get that fixed, and that's a very common complication of circumcision.
Right.
And so these things do come up even later on in life.
Right. Yeah, well, Jimmy Kimmel's a huge name, so that helps the audience really connect with what's going on. Now, after the UK, I then came to the US. I joined you guys at your demonstration, at the wonderful Intaction demonstration in Union Square. And I've seen some big changes there, which I'd like to ask you about, which were really innovative. But just before I ask you about that, I'll just finish off explaining the journey. Then I liaised with some UNICEF staff, some child protection specialists at UNICEF, and they're doing a lot of really good work in Africa, protecting girls from the harms of genital cutting. And what I'm trying to do in working with them is expand their view so that they can see that they can take that good work on protecting girls and expand it to all children, both female, male, and intersex. They are starting to become more open to the idea, and I think this is a really exciting opportunity that they are starting to see for the first time that maybe we should protect all children. It's not a sort of one or the other thing. Then the final meeting I've had is then I went up to Montreal in Canada, and I met with the Algosphere Alliance, an amazing French network of activists. And what they are is the Anglosphere Alliance are a group that a worldwide group that are dedicated to the alleviation of suffering. So wherever they can, in what way they can, they want to reduce suffering, whether it be children suffering from circumcision, whether it be animals suffering from bad slaughterhouse practices, whether it be
just abuse,
or just abuse, whether it be gender inequality, whether it be poverty. Whatever walk of life where the suffering is being caused, they're looking at alleviating that. So they have this umbrella structure, and then they build in these tiers with their specific organisations. So they'll have Intactivism, the child protection tier, that column, and they'll have the poverty reduction tier, they'll have the equality tier, they'll have the animal reduction of suffering for animals tier. So it's a really clever and innovative setup. It's next level. It's looking, instead of looking myopically, it's really broadening our horizons and focusing on what really matters, which is the alleviation of suffering. And so I'm now partnering with them, Foreskin Revolution, now partnering with the Algosphere Alliance and their particular children's rights column, which is their French organisation. Now, I may not pronounce this right, Droit de Corps. And if you read that in English, it would read Droit à Corps, but I think my pronunciation is terrible, but Droit de Corps. And they have been very active in France for many, many years. They're the specific Intactivist arm. And they have a whole global strategy themselves, plus they have a strategy with the Algosphere Alliance And this is really exciting. This is an exciting trend where all of us can potentially get together, whether we're intactivists, whether we're animal rights activists, whether we're feminists, whether we're children's rights activists, whether we're trying to reduce poverty, and we can all work together towards the alleviation of suffering. And we can combine and pool not just our resources, but we can combine and pool our networks and our strategy.
That sounds really interesting. It was quite a lot of traveling you did.
Yeah, I'm getting pretty dizzy these days. I don't know where I am anymore. I don't know where I am right now.
But before you left on this traveling, you have your own group called the Foreskin Revolution, and you had some early progress in what you were doing with Foreskin Revolution. So just tell us just quickly what's been going on down under with Foreskin Revolution.
Yeah, why amputate when you can celebrate, kids? Here's the foreskin fist bump. Let's do one. Yeah! So it feels better. So in Australia, we launched around April or May, and straight away we got on national television, which was just fantastic. In Australia, the equivalent of like PBS or the BBC, which in Australia is called SBS, and the ABC, they have a show called The Feed, which is like Viceland Vice. And they filmed us. They did an 11-minute episode on foreskin restoration. And they had two guys who were, and you can just Google it, SBS, The Feed, foreskin restoration, the foreskin revolution comes to Australia, and you'll be able to watch the video. And they had two guys restoring, myself as the activist, and then they had a doctor who does circumcisions. It was a fantastic piece, and it just shows how much things have shifted in Australia with these young guys looking to restore to reclaim what was taken from them. And then we got a piece, we were interviewed by The Guardian in the UK. Our creative director was interviewed about our marketing strategy. We had a piece in the Daily Mail. We had and then various pieces on other channels, and we're across all social media platforms. So far we've done 7 YouTube videos. We've got the Facebook channel, the Instagram, Twitter. And it's really just taken off, and we've started to build members on the east coast of Australia. We've got one so far in Western Australia and looking to grow. So it's just all happening out of nowhere. It's very exciting. And when I get back to Australia, we're going to do the first Australian large-scale demonstrations of this kind with children's rights and Intactivism. There was Jeremy, an activist by the name of Jeremy, did a one-man protest outside Oprah in Adelaide or Melbourne, which was awesome. But we'll be doing the first group large-scale demonstrations, and I think the impact could be big because Australians are really ready to move beyond circumcision.
Yeah, you've got some good cultural trends going on there in terms of being against circumcision, because more and more of the guys are intact, and so you don't have as much opposition, you have as much convincing to do.
That's right, the culture shifted. The culture shifted dramatically. So the cultural resistance is a lot smaller. So like some of the older guys who were cut, the younger guys are intact, so there's a lot less cultural resistance. And anyway, even a lot of the older parents who were cut did not cut their kids. So even a lot of them have shifted. So it's really now a case of just tidying up, another good pun. It's just all the little sort of bits and pieces we have to do to really move beyond this. So it's an exciting time in Australia, and one thing we've really drawn from at Foreskin Revolution heavily is from Intaction, from the Canadian Foreskin Awareness Project, from Jonathan Friedman in New York, Intactivists of New York. All groups that I've had contact with or worked with directly. I've done a lot of work with yourself with Intaction and New York Intactivists. You're all foreskin positive, and that's been a huge influence on the Foreskin Revolution, and things like the foreskin salute or the foreskin fist bump. Things that make it fun. They celebrate the foreskin and celebrate the foreskin positive message: whole body pleasure, lifetime lubrication, and
what we call the 4 powers of foreskin: pleasure, protection, lubrication, and connection. Who doesn't want more of that?
Exactly. Yeah. That's it. Why amputate when you can celebrate? Why cut when you can cuddle? And so it's interesting because for me, Coming back to the States just now to see the recent demonstration in its new iteration with the, now you've implemented the tent, the 4 Powers of Foreskin tent. And I wanted to ask you about this because formerly you've always used a truck with the billboard, big advertising truck with the giant billboard. The first campaign, I Did Not Consent, a few years back, and then the recent campaign, Foreskin, A Girl Can Hope. Now you've added to the giant advertising truck in Union Square every month. Now you've also got a giant tent, and I'd love you to share, what impact that's had.
Well, the tent it broadens the visual impact of what we do. We set up in a large park in New York City, a park plaza, which gets a lot of pedestrian traffic. Thousands of people stream past our exhibits, and we have many exhibits. First of all, we have our mobile education unit, which is the billboard truck, with currently running the Foreskin, A Girl Can Hope campaign on it. On that truck, we have our infant genital cutting exhibit, which is a lifelike, realistic 3D diorama of what a baby goes through during circumcision by a doctor in hospital. So everything in that exhibit is identical to what is done in hospitals, and there's actually an audio track it's an interactive where people can push a button and play the audio track of a baby being circumcised, and the screaming, the blood-curdling screams that they hear. If anyone thinks that babies slept through it or they only made a little cry and that was it, when they hear that, it totally debunks that myth. Because babies scream bloody murder when they're being circumcised. And so we have that infant genital cutting exhibit, which is one of our most popular exhibits. And we also have a poster exhibit called The Bizarre History of American Circumcision, which shows how circumcision in America was really based on 3 legs, which was sexual repression in terms of the whole history with Kellogg's and prevention of masturbation at the turn of the century, racism, there's elements of racism, circumcision. Peter Remondino, who was a popular medical doctor over the time, recommended circumcision of African Americans, and xenophobia was built into that. And then the third leg, which was fake medical claims, which we all know. Even the president of the American Medical Association at the time, John Sayer, he claimed that circumcision cured everything from hip dysplasia to constipation to almost any issue a baby might have. Circumcision seemed to cure it. So that poster exhibit is also very popular, and we also have takeaway literature that accompanies it. But we recently added this very large 10 by 15 pop-up tent, which says the 4 Powers of Foreskin on it. It's very visually eye-catching because it's bright red and orange colors, and it has the 4 Powers of Foreskin on the backdrop of it, which is pleasure, protection, lubrication, and connection. So this is really these bright colors. When people stream by, it really gets their attention. And if we ever get caught in a thunderstorm, it's great to shelter under during that, so we don't have to close up. So that, plus all of the literature we give out, we have a large literature rack, which many pieces of literature that Intaction has developed. It's professionally done, and it just adds to the credibility of what we're talking about.
Yeah, because I was really struck this time, having worked with Intaction over the years, I was really struck this time round in doing a demonstration with the presence of this big tent in Union Square where thousands of people are walking past, and because I've always previously done activism around the truck, I didn't know what to expect, and this time it was just really interesting to see that the tent really grounded things. It gave people a space to just come over and hang out, and people would just hang out at the tent. They stand under the tent, they stand beside the shirts for sale, they'd look around. It gives you like a shop front, and it creates this nice casual festive atmosphere, and also it's just amazing branding for the 4 Powers of Foreskin.
Yeah, well, it all feeds into our Foreskin Positive campaign. And what our experience has been, as opposed to the older Circumcision I Did Not Consent campaign, is that the Foreskin Positive campaign has empowered intact guys and parents of intact children to engage with us because they see that we're Foreskin Positive, and they're looking for that. They're looking for that support and reinforce the decisions that they've made, either for their children or for themselves, to stay intact. And so they come, all these intact guys and parents are coming up to us, and they're taking literature for parents. We have a special comic strip that's age appropriate for younger children. It's called the Intact Dude's Guide to Foreskin Superpowers. And it's like a really cool illustrated piece. And so parents can give this to their sons to help give them confidence in that they're the ones with the advantages, not their cut peers. And intact guys too, that they're so happy that we're promoting the benefits of foreskin. So, and the thing is that I don't know that Intactivism has really exploited this enough, but intact guys and intact parents are a natural base of support for our movement. And you really want to tap into that base of support first before you go into the people that are either circumcised or have circumcised their kids, which is kind of like the opposition camp, if we could use that term, and try to get support from them. Because that's going to be a much more difficult sell. But if you can go to talk to intact guys and parents of intact children, they agree with you. So that's where you want to start. You want to start from your base of support and branch out from there. So that's what this new campaign has taught us quite a bit about.
That's a really interesting synergy with the Algosphere Alliance and with Droit de Corps, or DAC for short, if you want to use the acronym. They focus on what they call their lateral allies, the same philosophy, and I think that's incredibly powerful. They have they specifically say, like, why would you waste resources focusing just on opposition when your lateral allies, there's so much more energy there and so much more of a connection, and you can really synergize together and achieve so much more. Interesting.
Definitely. And the other thing is before you can convince people not to cut off foreskin, you got to convince them that it's worth keeping.
Yes.
You know? So if people think foreskin is worthless or a useless piece of skin, is how it's often termed, then why not cut it off and even avoid problems, however remote they may be? Cut it off and avoid a problem. But when they realize they're cutting off something very valuable, then that would give them pause to reconsider.
Yes, and actually, the other thing that I'm curious to explore with you as well, in addition to the new campaign with the tent, the 4 Powers of Foreskin tent that gives you all this presence in Union Square, what are just your general thoughts on the actual campaign, the Foreskin a Girl Can Hope campaign, which has been running for 2 years now, and you've got so beautifully billboarded on the truck. Tell me about the pros and cons and your reflections on that.
Again, I think it empowers intact guys, and they, when we're in Union Square, they come up to us and they engage with us and they thank us for being out there and portraying the intact body in this fashion. It's a billboard ad. It was designed to be kind of a sexy, attention-grabbing ad, and I think it does that. And I think people, for the most part, also get that it's an attempt by us to reduce circumcision, that we're anti-circumcision, and we're doing that by promoting foreskin. Right. So I think for the most part, people get that. Right. I've found that we don't seem to get into the debates like we get in the past. In past years, we've been running these campaigns and being out in public events for many, many years. And in the past, when we used the word circumcision, I did not consent, we'd get debate after debate, people coming up and trying to prove to us why circumcision is a good thing. And now with being foreskin positive, we don't get into these arguments and we're not in debating mode anymore. We just get into talking about why foreskin is so great to have and why we shouldn't be cutting it off our children's bodies. And that, plus the support of the intact men and the intact parents, it's like a home run. Right.
Excellent. So you're really happy with the progress of the new campaign overall.
Definitely, yeah.
That's great news. And also you've talked about how you really now are looking to not just market in terms of just information, but now you're really looking at terms of increasing engagement. So for example, you're doing podcasts now, you're doing lots of radio interviews, and rather than just giving information, you talk a lot about pivoting and pitching.
Yeah, well, we give out a lot of literature and a lot of information, But I think we've been missing the mark a little bit on that respect, in that we're not pitching. So we're telling people circumcision is bad, but we're not telling them why that's important to them. And so commonly you hear like people might pass by and say, well, I'm cut already, nothing I can do. We're not telling them why this is important to them. Even if they're cut, even if they're female or they don't have a penis, this is still we have to convince them that this is still an important issue for them and for everybody. And it's somewhat similar to what they're doing up in Canada, where they want to reduce suffering overall. That's a laudable goal that anybody should be interested in. But we're going to do it slightly differently, and we just need to show people how that this relates to them. And that's one of the future projects we're going to be working on, and we're going to be slightly adjusting some of our messaging and some of our literature to help people understand that baby that's born is being cut is really no different from who they are. And it's just as you wouldn't want to be held down and cut, that baby doesn't want to be held down and cut. And you wouldn't do it to an adult, so why would you do it to a baby? And so that's going to be a slight change in direction going forward. So I think that'll really help people relate to what's going on.
Yeah, because I know you've said to me before in conversation that with all the new interviews you're doing, you want to try and make it engaging and memorable, and but also take complex information and make it digestible, and then again make it really engaging. And I remember you said to take that and some penis and sex, and everybody's interested.
Absolutely. Who doesn't want to talk about sex? Who doesn't want to talk about penis? I mean, you have to understand, the most trafficked websites on the internet are porn sites, okay? So this is something that does get people's attention, and then you throw in the subconscious hypocrisy and dissonance that's going on in people's minds, is the fact that we're doing this to babies. We're basically torturing them in their earliest days of life. It's a topic people want to talk about, but our job as Intactivists is to take this complex information on these medical studies and the literature and kind of distill it down and make it so that the average person out there can understand it and relate to it and find it interesting and hopefully want to engage on the issue with us on it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, it's a bright future. The Intaction's gone from strength to strength. Now Foreskin Revolution have joined the fray. We're currently on our world tour to build strategic global partnerships. We're trying to really unite the international community. I've made enormous connections now with British organisations, Intact Denmark. I'm now in contact with Intact networks from Finland and Norway and Mugus in Germany. There's a whole world of activists out there that now I'm partnering with, and of course everybody in the States. And I think that moving forward, as we collaborate more internationally and globally and share our resources and our strategy, things will really shift on this issue. So it's a really exciting time, and with all the amazing work that Intaction's been doing, the 4 Powers of Foreskin tent, the Foreskin a Girl Can Hope campaign. The future, I think, looks bright for protecting children.
We're picking up steam, and more organizations like yourself get involved. We'll be collaborating together, and we'll find out what's working in other areas and try to imitate that. And what's not working, we'll move on from that and try something else. And the future looks brighter and brighter for keeping babies intact.
The future is foreskin.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys. All right.
All right.